And welcome, students. As we dive into our next lesson today, let's discuss copyright, fair use, and plagiarism, topics that you may be familiar with, or you may not be so familiar with. But without further ado, let's just jump right in. The first thing we should understand is the role of copyright and technology. The development of digital media and computer network technologies have introduced new difficulties enforcing copyright simply because of the ease of which information and data can be transmitted. This inspired additional challenges to the philosophical basis of copyright law. Because you understand, when copyright law was first introduced, back then everything was like printed works. So in order for you to make a copy of a printed work, you probably would have to have like your own printing press of some kind. So it was a lot harder to produce forgeries of, like, let's say, a written work. Or even when you started getting to recordings, you'd have to have the equipment in order to do so. So it was a lot easier to prove copyright infringement in some ways because the amount of people that could do it was limited. Now, though, with the proliferation of the digital environment, almost anybody can get involved in potential copyright infringement. Now, businesses with great economic dependence, such as large corporations, depend upon copyright, such as the music industry. You could also look at like television, movie, film, etc. They have advocated the extension and expansion of copyright laws. In fact, in the U.S., it's been changed several times, particularly because of Disney is one of the great examples of this. They have extended the copyright because otherwise Mickey Mouse at this point in time would be in the public domain. However, he is still protected under copyright law for a few more years thanks to the efforts of Disney. And they have sought, therefore, legal and technological enforcement. Things such as the DMCA is a law that allows them to put takedown notices for copyright infringement upon websites. Anyone that's ever watched YouTube, you might have seen YouTubers get hit with copyright strikes. So then they have to take down a video or remove the audio or something like that. So what exactly is copyright then? Well, copyright is the exclusive legal right given to a creator of an original work to decide how their literary, artistic, or musical work may be used by others. Now, the key thing to note about copyright is that these rights aren't absolute. All right, they're not like concrete and steel. There are ways kind of around it, and the most common way is through that of fair use. Fair use is, kind of the way you can use bits of copyrighted material, can't use the whole thing, in not, have to worry about getting in trouble. Now, a copyright only protects the expression of ideas, but not necessarily the idea itself. You can't copyright an idea. An idea would be, not necessarily like a story idea, but it would be something, for example, like, the idea that you have freedom of speech. You can't copyright the freedom of speech. Now, depending upon the country, a copyright typically lasts anywhere from 50 to 100 years after the death of its creator. It varies from country to country because each country has its own copyright laws in place. Now, we can't talk about copyright without discussing the Creative Commons. Creative Commons is one of several public copyright licenses that enables the free distribution of otherwise copyrighted work. Now, there are multiple versions of Creative Commons licenses. Each one have different levels of restrictions or attributions that you have to use. Now, a Creative Commons license is typically used when an author wants to give people the right to share, use, and build upon a work that they've created. They're not just throwing it out to public domain. Usually they want some kind of credit back to it. Now, Creative Commons provides an author flexibility, such as non-commercial uses of their own works. So it's like, hey, if you're not going to use this for profit, feel free to knock yourself out. And it also protects the people who use or redistribute the author's work from concerns of copyright infringement, as long as they abide by the conditions that are specified within the license. As I mentioned, there are multiple Creative Commons licenses out there. So in order for you to use it, you make sure you just follow the rules and conditions of that license. Now, there's one more thing which is kind of related to Creative Commons, which is that of the public domain. And public domain is a beautiful thing because the public domain consists of all the creative works to which no exclusive intellectual property rights apply. So what does that mean? Well, if there's no intellectual property rights, it means you can just use it however you want. Typically, this is because the rights have expired, they've been forfeited, or the author of it wasn't interested in retaining it. They're like, hey, I'm going to make this thing, whether it's an audio recording, it's a movie, it's a book, and I want people to freely be able to use it. They expressly waived it, or it may not be applicable. Right? For example, like ideas, you can't copyright ideas. So those are stuff that's part of the public domain. Now, other examples of things that might be in public domain, such as the works of Shakespeare, because he's from like the 1600s, Beethoven, most early silent films, because copyright didn't exist for the film industry at that point, and or they have since expired because they're so old. These are all considered to be in the public domain, either by virtue or having been created before copyright laws really existed, or as I mentioned, the copyright term has expired. Because originally, copyright law was like, I think in the earliest iterations was something like, to the death of the author, maybe 25 years, and it's expanded since then. So you have a lot of these early films, for example, when we talk about early silent films, the copyright law has expired, so it allows them to slip into the public domain. Now, some works are not covered by copyright, and therefore are in the public domain. You can't copyright certain things, whether it's one thing or another. So instead, they get thrown into the public domain. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there is one exception to that of the copyright law. The way you can kind of get around it if you're not, using a Creative Commons license or the public domain, you want to use a copyrighted work, and that is through fair use. Now, fair use is a doctrine in the law of the U.S. Right? And there are similar things in other countries, but mostly since we're in the U.S., we're going to talk about that. That permits limited use of copyrighted material without having to first acquire permission from the copyright holder. Because normally, if you want to use a copyright work and you want to, let's say, use it in a project or something, you need to contact the copyright holder, get explicit permission, usually like a written one, because you want to be able to verify that it was a written copy, not verbal, and then you can use that work. However, without that, then you have to either not use the copyrighted work or hope that you can qualify under fair use. Now, fair use is, as I mentioned, one of the limitations to copyright intended to balance the interests of copyright holders with the public interest in the wider distribution and use of creative works by allowing as a defense to copyright infringement claims certain limited uses that may otherwise be considered infringement. So it allows you to use that copyrighted material in a limited manner. So you can't just really use it however you want, but it does allow for some leeway of it. Like I said, it's kind of the exception to the rule. So let's actually look at what fair use is, because that's a lot of words to kind of digest here. Well, there are 5 categories that are typically considered to be fair use. Criticism and commentary is the first one. So this is when you're quoting or accepting a work in a review, or you're criticizing for purposes of either illustration or commentary, which would normally be fair use. Right? So, for example, people who do things like movie reviews or book reviews, they would fall under this piece of fair use because they might show clips from the film, or like let's say they're doing a book, they might read a passage from the book or talk about the characters of the plot. They're not trying to pass the book off as their own. Instead, they're trying to give feedback about it. News reporting, right? So summarizing either an address or an article with brief quotations in a news report constitutes fair use. So if you're reading an article and they put quotes about something, then that's fair use. Or if they're, let's say, using a clip in something that might be used by somebody else, hey, they'll you can use short bits of things because as long as you're quoting it, it can constitute here under news reporting. Obviously, you want to make sure you pay respects of who's using what, but this is how you can get by with fair use. Now, research and scholarship is another one where you can quote a short passage in a scholarly, scientific, or technical work for either illustration or clarification of the author's observations, which would be deemed acceptable. Right? Think about when we're writing a paper, for example. You can quote something that someone else has written. This is kind of fair use because technically, when somebody writes a document, and they publish it, or even they just write it, it can be considered copyrighted to that author. So when we are quoting that stuff, we're qualifying under fair use because a lot of times we're doing it for an academic setting. Now, speaking of academic, nonprofit education usage. So things such as limited uses of copies of classroom materials. This, is the most common example you'll see of this. So, for example, teacher makes, copies for like maybe some worksheets or something like that. That can qualify under fair use. Now, the sketchy area they get into is like, for example, if a teacher wants to watch a video in the classroom. Because if you just want to watch a video in the classroom, that actually may not qualify under fair use, because there is some gray area there, because it's typically when people purchase a video, it's purchased for home use, not for classroom use. So it gets into some area that's highly contested in terms of, it's not fair use, but like pretty much it's so widespread, it'd be very hard to enforce. But again, there's those 4 areas, plus the 5th one, which some of you may be familiar with, which is that of parody. Parody, of course, is a work that ridicules another, usually well known, by imitating it in a comedic or comical way. So if you're familiar with any, artist that might take something, make a spoof of it, that falls under parody. Right? So it allows you to parody something well known. So if it is a really famous film that comes out, and you're like, hey, I'm gonna make my own version of that, it'll be parody. All right, as long as you are doing it in a kind of a fun, comical way. If you just like do a straight ripoff and say, well, this is parody, that doesn't qualify. It has to, change the work in such a manner. So that is where we get into this next piece, is how to determine its fair use. Okay, you might say, well, it qualifies under this category. All right, it might, but there's a set of rules that haven't passed down. There's 4 of them that determine whether or not the action is fair use. So the first thing is the purpose and character of the use. So whether or not you're copying the work or forging something completely new is the single most important factor in determining whether it qualifies as fair use. So are you just simply using the work verbatim, or are you making something that's transformative? And that's the key thing to look at. Is it a transformative work? Has it changed the original from, its role, its purpose, into something new? What's the nature of the copyright work? What aspects of the work are relevant to copyright, such as, is it a fiction or a non-fiction work? And as I mentioned before, facts and ideas are not protectable by copyright. So if you're simply just reporting the facts, for example, so if you're doing the newscast, that can't be copyrighted, so that allows you to use that. Amount and sustainability, the more you take from original work, the less likely it is to be considered fair use. All right, because generally if you're taking, let's say, more and more and more of a work, well, that means you're trying to pass off more information from that work as your own. So therefore, when you want to use the fair use clause here, you want to make sure that kind of less is more. All right, so less you use, the more likely it will be fair use. And what's the effect upon the work's value? Now here, this one, it's not so much on you as it is on the original copyright holder. So the burden of proof comes to them to say, hey, this impacted my work. Now, a key thing to remember is that without consent, unless you get a copyright holder's consent, you cannot use another person's protected expression in a way that restricts the market for his or her work. All right, and so this is where people do things like parody have to make sure that it's transformative enough that it's not going to be just like a ripoff. Right? You can't just say, "Oh, it's the same story, just with a different cast of characters." That's not necessarily a change. That would be something else. Another thing is to note is that attribution does not constitute fair use. If you put like a video up on YouTube and you say all rights reserved to this corporation, that doesn't necessarily qualify for fair use. All that's saying is that you acknowledge the copyright holders, and it doesn't necessarily have that much legal water when you do that. So you have to know that if you're going to use something copyrighted, you have to go through the proper steps of using it, or make sure that you're following these 4 rules in order to make sure your work qualifies of that of fair use. All right, and let's get into our last topic of today, which is that of plagiarism. Now, plagiarism is probably something you're familiar with. It's the wrongful appropriation or publication of another author's work passed off as your own. An easy way to think about this in an academic setting is cheating. All right, cheating would be considered plagiarism. All right, Plagiarism is considered by many regards to be both academically dishonest and a breach of ethics. And it may also constitute copyright infringement. When I talk about the academic side of things, you're kind of, when you quote things, it kind of gets in that. So there is an interweaving here with copyright law. Now, what's interesting about plagiarism is that there's not necessarily any law in the books about plagiarism. You won't get punished for plagiarizing by the law. You're not going to go to jail for it. They'll be like, police obviously won't care, unless it broke copyright law. But instead, where you'll get your punishment will come then from institutions such as colleges or universities who may award appropriate sanctions or punishments. So whether it's a suspension or an expulsion in the extreme case, they will levy things against you. Maybe you'll fail an assignment or class or something like that. Now, obviously, we've seen plagiarism, but let's just talk about a few common forms of what plagiarism might look like. Because obviously, yes, if I copy my friend's paper and I turn it in as my own, that's an obvious example. But there are other ways. So submitting someone's work as my own, I already mentioned that. Made a copy of it, turned it in, teacher called me, I'm in trouble now. All right. Or I could also take passages from something else I've written without, adding citations. All right. So you can't just take a previous assignment you've done, pass it off. Rewriting someone else's work without properly citing sources. So let's say someone's written a book and you're like, hey, I'm going to use this book in my story. I put quotes around it, but I didn't put any source page to tell where that information is coming from. If you cite some but not all the passages that should be cited, it could be another instance of plagiarism. So let's say you put your citation page in and you put some quotes in your paper, but you only quoted, let's say, 1 or 2 of them when you have like 3 or 5 passages. You want to make sure that all those passages are included. Melding together cited and uncited sections of the original piece. So anytime you're pulling anything from the original work, whether it's a book, a website, whatever, you want to make sure that whatever you're quoting comes through in its entirety. If it's coming out verbatim, you want to make sure you're quoting that whole thing. If you're paraphrasing, it's a little different, but if you're quoting it in its entirety, you need to make sure that that is cited correctly. Providing proper citations, but failing to change the structure and wording of the borrowed idea. So even though that would be, let's say I, quote a website, but the information that I've put in there, I just copy pasted it over and just put in quotations. I didn't change the structure of it in any way that can actually help my paper. It's just in there for the sake of being in there. Inaccurately citing the source. This is a big one that we're going to work on. A lot of people know it's like, hey, I need to cite my sources. So they'll go off, they'll copy the URL, they'll paste into a citation generator, for example. The citation generator will go through and create a citation. And you're like, hey, look, I got a citation. This is awesome. And then they paste that citation into their references page or their works cited page. The problem is that those citation generators are not always completely accurate. And that's a big thing that we're going to talk about tomorrow when we talk about, or the next lesson, I should say, when we talk about citations, because they don't always pull every bit of information that is available on that web page. They'll pull most of it. Sometimes they will pull hardly any of it. So it's up to you to verify that that information is correct. Relying too heavily on other people's works and failing to bring original thought into the text. This kind of spirals back into melding together cited and uncited pieces of original. When you're constructing your paper, you want to make sure that the primary voice in that paper is not the quotes. You want to make sure that it's still you. So you're still the one driving the narrative, whether it's an informative essay, an argumentative essay, a technical writing paper, whatever it is. You want to make sure that you're the main voice in that work. All right, and that's going to wrap up today's lesson, folks. Hopefully that is enough, and I will see you all next time.